So this marks the beginning here of part 4 of my commentary on the Platonic dialogue, Cratylus. We have been talking about the etymology of words. Specifically, we have been talking about a few different arguments that were proposed in the beginning. We've centered on one argument that is of the origin of words, having to do with the nature of the thing that it is named after. And we have advanced in this discussion, or we have followed this discussion in an advance to an interesting point about the fundamentals, about the very origin or the name setters or the rule setters. Socrates views these people as wise people for developing language, for developing words. And we've been concerned about going over in detail various numbers of different words, where they might come from, their roots, the various ornamentation through the addition or subtraction of various letters, which Socrates says is distasteful. It takes away from the truth or the meaning of the word. And we also have this slowly forming philosophy within the dialogue, sort of underneath the current of all of these different explanations. Some constant. And this constant really has to do with a center point around which we operate, so that we may understand between one another what something is. It's very fundamental. It's basic to our understanding, not only on the individual level, for categorizing different things, placing boundaries between things so that we can differentiate between them, but also communication between individuals so that we can maintain societies and a somewhat coherent collective. And so the question is, well, what are we surrounding, really? In some sense, this is not the main point of the dialogue, although it is important to include this, because it has to do, again, with the fundamentals of human action, of human belief. And so, much of our discussion thus far has been talking about this at some time, at once. Perhaps we could say it's mysterious, the flow of things. And that much of what the good is, of knowledge and of wisdom and understanding, is in relation to this motion. Our understanding is the longing for the new, perhaps the new understanding that allows us to jump on the train, let's say, the train of motion, so that we can be in harmony with it. And as we stray from it, this is where we start to get more and more negative terms, like disadvantageous, non-beneficial, unprofitable, non-gainful. And if we are in tandem, we are in operation with this motion that we can say, in some sense, is the good, or is the action of the good, which penetrates all things. And this penetrating power is something that we consider to be gainful. Now again, this motion, once we find ourselves moving with it, moving with the good, then it is said that we know. And so, our understanding of the process, of our orientation to the fundamental, around which our language, and as it would seem, our belief and view of reality is surrounded. Or I should say that our belief surrounds what is. That is to say, if it is to be true. And if what we are and what we believe and what we know is to be true, then our fundamental concepts, our language, must be oriented in that direction, or with that motion. And so, with that, we will continue here. Now, I left off on part 3, foregoing the reading line by line. I may pick that up again at some point, I don't know, but I think it's good to come out of it every once in a while, and just to give an overhead view of what is being discussed. Sort of give my ad-lib literary account here of how this dialogue is going. So we left off last time before the conversation switched into discussing different words. And those words are the advantageous, the profitable, the beneficial, the gainful. The gainful, which we've already spoken of. Now, the advantageous is the movement of the soul in accord with the movement of things. And we have to remember that the fastest of this movement is the good. It must necessarily be the fastest thing. It penetrates all things. Now, what is profitable? Socrates mentions the use of the word in more of an economic sense, which he says some people use to mean the profit that releases a capital sum for reinvestment. But this, he says, is not really the point of the word. It's not where its origin comes from. Its origin is to give relevance to the good. And that is to say that Socrates believes that the good is said to be this word lustitilaun, because it does away with any end to motion. Again, this motion is our fundamental good. And beneficial, he says, it derives from the word meaning to increase and the word meaning to make. And so we have to make something and to increase something. And so what is beneficial? Beneficial, well, we understand that it is a form of the good. It's related to the good if it is beneficial to increase or to make. We are making this, facilitating this motion, and we are increasing this motion. And Hermogenes is then concerned and would like to know about the opposites of those words. He wants to know about disadvantageous, non-beneficial, unprofitable, non-gainful. Socrates says that those that are mere negations don't need any discussion. We can understand what these words are in relation to what we've already described, that they serve to inhibit motion in some way. But Socrates would like to discuss what is harmful. He says that which is harming or harmful limits flow. He says that which is harming signifies the wanting to grasp. Now it's interesting here because we can get lost fairly quickly in some of the previous conversation that this wanting or this longing for grasping could be the case for understanding in some way. But it's not the right form of this grasping or of wanting. He says grasping is the same as shackling. The name giver always finds fault with this shackling. But also to grasp something, I think there is a component of this grasping within wisdom. But the grasp is not necessarily the shackling and the limiting of motion. It is the understanding and moving with this motion. It's the grasping of the whole of it, the concept. But in another sense, the shackling and the limitation can serve to prevent motion, which is why it can be harming or harmful. Now we come to semiotis, or hurtful. Instead of going right into this explanation of what the word means, Socrates says that this is a good example of one of these words that, if changed slightly, can mean its opposite. And how in their modern language, many of their words, maybe not many, but certainly there are a few good examples where what was intended to be the meaning of a word is now completely the opposite. Another example that Socrates gives here: in ancient times, the word for day, was called Himera. And in Socrates' day, it is called Hemera. Now this slight change of the word, is a big deal, because the true meaning, the origin of the word initially, this Himera, it used to be called so because people, as Socrates says, welcomes the daylight that comes out of the darkness, and the longing for it, and that's why they named it Himera. He says, but nowadays the name is so dressed up that no one can understand what it means, although there are some who think the day is called Hemera because it makes things gentle. And so you have two very different words there, the meaning of the words. One, the day for making things gentle, and then the day, sort of the light coming from the darkness, and the people that are longing for that light from the darkness. Now another good example here that's sort of antagonistic to the rule setter and their way of seeing things, orienting themselves around this motion of the highest thing, of the good. The word dion, or obligation, when it's pronounced in that way, Socrates says, seems at first to signify the opposite of all the other names for the good. After all, even though an obligation is a kind of good, dion plainly signifies a shackle, desmos, an obstacle to motion, and obstacle to motion, and so is closely akin to that word harmful. And so again, context matters here, because obligation can be seen as a kind of good. And if we change obligation truly into something that is harmful, then we miss the aspects of the good that that would otherwise not be seen if we had not explored the aspect of the word of obligation. And so we see, I feel this sense of bringing light to the mind through our interpretation of our understanding of our words. And if our words are all downtrodden, they look beneath, they do not have the higher sophisticated meanings to them, then that severely degrades our use of this language. And so if we change the word slightly from D-E-O-N to D-I-O-N, D-I-O-N meaning passing through, and D-E-O-N purely obligation, this signifies a good, and is a term of praise, says Socrates. He says, so the name-giver didn't contradict himself, and D-E-O-N, or obligation, is plainly the same as aphelemon, or beneficial, profitable, gainful, good, advantageous, or lack of perplexity. He says, which are different names signifying what orders and moves. He says, this is always praised, while that which restrains and shackles is found fault with. Likewise, in the case of semiotis, hurtful, if you replace Z with a D, as in the ancient language, it will be plain to you that the name was given to what shackles motion, since demiotis derives from that. Doxa, or opinion, either derives from the pursuit the soul engages in when it hunts for the knowledge of how things are, or it derives from the shooting of a bow. Toxon. But the latter is more likely. At any rate, thinking is in harmony with it. It seems to express the fact that thinking is the motion, or oasis, of the soul towards everything, towards how each of the things that are really is. In the same way, planning has to do with trying to hit some target, and wishing and deliberating signify aiming at something. All these names seem to go along with doxa, in that they are like bole, which is trying to hit, or to hit, like trying to hit some target. Similarly, the opposite, abolia, lack of planning, seems to signify a failure to get something, as when someone fails to hit or get what he shot at, wished for, planned, or desired. And so that's an interesting way to conceptualize opinion. I would think that opinion, if we were to describe it today, it would have to be some expression of thought that we would consider to be subjective. It wouldn't be grounded in truth. But of course this sort of definition doesn't seem to fit, because certainly there must be true opinions. But the way here that Socrates explains this, that opinion is likely derived from the shooting of a bow, and thinking is this motion of the soul towards everything, towards how each of the things that are really is, we can imagine this illustration that starts to form about the action of pulling the arrow back into the bow and releasing it. And it's this interwoven behavior that is represented in the broader image of taking aim at something, deliberately pulling the bow back, releasing the arrow to find a target. And if the arrow finds its target, we can say perhaps that it finds its truth. The opinion, the thought, and the result are all congruent. They are in line with that motion. The things that are really is. And he says, in the same way, planning, this is the B-O-U-L-E, planning, has to do with trying to hit, B-O-L-E, some target. And boulesthai, B-O-U-L-E-S-T-H-A-I, or wishing, and deliberating, or B-O-U-L-E-U-E-S-T-H-A-I, signify aiming at something. And so we have multiple words that describe intricate details of this image, of this behavior of man, this taking the bow and taking aim, this deliberation of finding some target, the wishing to find the target at all. And it's interesting to use such a practical behavior to describe and to produce words that really transcend the physical action in and of itself. But then again, the reason that we perform these behaviors has a certain reality, I guess we could say, to it. There's a reason for it. And it is interesting to me, amazing really, that the level of detail and attention or focus that one must have to analyze their behavior and physical motion in such a way to produce the language that accurately represents what is taking place. But more so than just that, because it's not just the action, as I've said. It is the metaphor to that physical behavior that then gives us a broader illustration from which to draw loftier concepts out of. I mean, we saw opinion, we saw thinking, we saw planning, wishing, deliberating. All of these words, left by themselves, it would take us forever to get to the illustration of pulling a bow, aiming at something, finding a target, and this sort of thing. But the behavior in and of itself, pre-existing the use of those words, is a very fortunate illustration and a simple teacher, perhaps, that I think that in many days and many and many motions throughout life, I myself don't necessarily pay attention enough to take the lessons of simple behaviors to heart and understand exactly why it is what I am doing and what words that I would give to what I am doing. Now, I wouldn't want that to seem like I'm trying to drag more out of this than is actually here, because I do believe that as simple as our day-to-day can be, I think if we stop and take a moment to reflect, whether it be through prayer or whatever you want to call some devoted action, or devoted thought, let's say, I think there's a lot that we can discover, not only about ourselves, but about others. Not necessarily in a judgmental way, but rather more in an observational sense. What can we imagine about the behavior that we all do every day? We wake up, we do our morning routine, whatever that might be. We plan, we budget our time, we get in the car or on the bus or on the train, and we go to a certain location, and we work, and we come home. And throughout all that experience, there are very fundamental things that we do, fundamental to human nature. And if we imagined for a moment that we had no language to describe, imagine that you woke up one morning and you had no language to describe what it is, what you were doing. How would you go about devising a method, a system of interpreting everything that is around you? Certainly it would start rather methodically to differentiate between different objects. And once it got to your own behavior, I would imagine it would get quite interesting. Because the questions of relevance begin to seep in. In the case of the behavior of the archer, why are you taking aim? What does it mean to find a target? It's rather simple in the case of a hunter or an archer that's practicing. You find a target because you have to hit it. And why do you have to hit it? How do you hit it? It depends on the end. But regardless of the end, if you do hit the target, you do achieve the goal. Hermogenes says, "The pace of investigating seems to be quickening, Socrates." And Socrates says, "That's because I'm coming to the finishing post." And he goes on to investigate a various number of words. I've skipped over a few, some of which don't seem to play too heavily on the nature of their discussion. But rather it seems like Socrates is in a bit of a state of flow, looking at different words and having fun with it. I imagine that soon they will come to a point of the further Socratic question and answer, and integrate what they have uncovered so far in terms of the various words and their meanings and their origin, and relate it back to the beginning part of their discussion. Because we have to remember, this is not a conversation just between Hermogenes and Socrates. This began as a conversation between Cratylus and Hermogenes, and Socrates was brought into the discussion. Of the Greek word that is voluntary, He says, the name expresses the fact that it signifies yielding and not resisting, but yielding, as I said before, to the motion, to the one that comes into being in accord with our wish. And compulsion and resistant, on the other hand, he says, since they signify motion contrary to our wish, they are associated with error and ignorance. Again, it's about this flow, it's against the flow, and he uses the sort of the prefix of the word, which is symbolized as the, or means, ravine. He says ravines restrain motion, since they are rough going, filled with bushes, and hard to get through. It's probably for this reason that we use the word anenkeon, in the way we do, because saying it is like trying to get through a ravine. Nonetheless, while my strength lasts, let's not stop using it. Don't you stop either, but keep asking your questions. And so Hermogenes says, well then, let me ask you about the finest and most important names: truth, falsehood, and being. And on the subject of our present conversation, name, and why it is so named. Socrates says, do you know what maesthai means? And Hermogenes says, yes, it means to search. Socrates says, well, onomia, or onoma, or name, seems to be a compressed statement, which says, that is a being for which there is a search. You can see this more easily in onomeston, or thing named, since it clearly says, this is a being for which there is a search. Aletheia, truth, is like these others in being compressed, for the divine motion of being is called aletheia because aletheia is a compressed form of the phrase a wandering that is divine. Pseudos, or falsehood, is the opposite of this motion, so that once again what is restrained or compelled to be inactive is reviled by the name giver, and likened to people asleep. But the meaning of this name is concealed by the addition of the PS. On, or being, or ousia, being, says the same as aletheia. Once an I is added, since it signifies going, ion, or ok an, not being, in turn is ok ion, not going, and indeed some people actually use that name for it. So this, what Socrates says is what is behind the word name. This is a being for which there is search. In my mind, this is the differentiation between different objects. Right? We are identifying the being. We are searching for its being. We are searching for its boundaries so that we can properly name it. We can properly categorize it. It's somewhat difficult to follow because it's not exactly a discussion that's engaged in what is truth. Again, it's just the name of truth. Hermogenes says, I think you've hammered these into shape manfully, Socrates, but suppose someone were to ask you about the correctness of the names ion, or going, rayon, flowing, or down, shackling. How should we answer him? Is that what you were going to say? Hermogenes says, yes, exactly. One way of giving the semblance of an answer has been suggested already. What way is that? To say that a name has a foreign origin when we don't know what it signifies. Now, it may well be true that some of these names are foreign, but it is also possible that the basic or first names are Greek, but not recoverable because they are so old. Names have been twisted in so many ways, indeed, that it wouldn't be surprising if the ancient Greek word was the same as the modern foreign one. At any rate, it wouldn't be at all inappropriate for you to respond that way. Socrates says, no, it probably wouldn't. Nevertheless, it seems to me that once we are in the competition, we are allowed no excuses, but must investigate these names vigorously. We should remember this, however. If someone asks about the terms from which a name is formed, and then about the ones from which those terms are formed, and keeps on doing this indefinitely, the answer must finally give up. Mustn't he? Hermogenes says, that's my view, at any rate. At what point would he be right to stop? Wouldn't it be when he reaches the names that are, as it were, the elements of all the other statements and names? For, if these are indeed elements, it cannot be right to suppose that they are composed out of other names. Consider agathos, good, for example. We said it is composed out of the agaston, or admirable, and thun, fast, and probably thun is composed out of other names, and those out still of other names. But if we ever get hold of a name that isn't composed out of other names, we'll be right to say that at last we've reached an element which cannot any longer be carried back to other names. Hermogenes says, that seems right to me at least. Socrates, and if the names you're asking about now turn out to be elements, won't we have to investigate their correctness in a different manner from the one we've been using so far? Probably so. It is certainly probable, Hermogenes. At any rate, it's obvious that all the earlier ones were resolved into these. So if they are indeed elements, as they seem to me to be, join me again in investigating them, to ensure that I don't talk nonsense about correctness of the first names. Hermogenes says, you have only to speak, and I will join in the investigation so far as I am able. Socrates, I think you agree with me that there is only one kind of correctness in all names, primary as well as derivative, and that considered simply as names, there is no difference between them. Now, I said I would probably approach this episode a bit differently, not reading verbatim, but I'm falling back into the reading verbatim. I think it's just a bit easier. So, you'll have to forgive me, but at least we can all follow the words of the dialogue here. And it seems like we are beginning, as I said earlier, to be progressing into something more of a discussion about the fundamentals, which is what we're always concerned about when we are reading philosophy, about the fundamentals, about the true nature of things. It was interesting to go into the discussion about the different words and things, but it seems that conversation is a bit dry, and we don't get as far as we would like to. We don't get as far as we can go, given investigating the more fundamental things. And so Socrates is talking about the elements or the building blocks of language, and things for which you cannot break down any further. It's the first principles thinking of language. Now he says, I think you agree with me that there is only one kind of correctness in all names. He says primary as well as derivative. And that considered simply as names, there is no difference between them. And so I'd like to see a conversation between this primary as well as that derivative. Hermogenes says certainly. Now the correctness of every name we analyzed was intended to consist in its expressing the nature of one of the things that are. Now Hermogenes says, of course. Socrates. And this is no less true of primary names than derivative ones, if indeed they are names. Hermogenes says certainly. But it seems that the derivative ones were able to accomplish this by means of the primary ones. And if the primary names are indeed names, they must make the things that are as clear as possible to us. But how can they do this when they aren't based on other names? Answer me this. If we hadn't had a voice or a tongue, and wanted to express things to one another, wouldn't we try to make signs by moving our hands, head, and the rest of our body, just as dumb people do at present? Hermogenes says, what other choice would we have, Socrates? So, if we wanted to express something light in weight or above us, I think we'd raise our hand towards the sky in imitation of the very nature of the thing. And if we wanted to express something heavy or below us, we'd move our hand towards the earth. And if we wanted to express a horse, or any other animal for that matter, galloping, you know that we'd make our bodies and gesture as much like theirs as possible. Hermogenes says, I think we'd have to. Socrates, because the only way to express anything by means of our body is to have our body initiate whatever we want to express. Hermogenes says yes. So if we want to express a particular fact by using our voice, tongue, and mouth, we will successfully do in doing so. We will succeed in doing so if we succeed in imitating it by means of them. Hermogenes says that must be right, I think. It seems to follow that a name is a vocal imitation of what it imitates, and that someone who imitates something with his voice names what he imitates. And it's not quite the case, is it, that if we are to name an animal, we don't make the noise that the animal makes? Although that would be a way of representing the animal. We have a more sophisticated way of doing this. We don't neigh like a horse to represent the horse, we say horse. Perhaps the name is more encompassing. Socrates says, well, I don't. Replying to Hermogenes says, when he says, I think so. Well, I don't. I don't think this is a fine thing to say at all. Hermogenes says, why not? Socrates, because then we'd have to agree that those who imitate sheep, cocks, or other animals are naming the things they imitate. Hermogenes says that's true, we would. And do you think that's a fine conclusion? And so Hermogenes says, no, I don't. But then what sort of imitation is a name, Socrates? Socrates says, in the first place, if we imitate things the way we imitate them in music, we won't be naming them, not even if the imitation is question is vocal. And the same holds if we imitate the things music imitates. What I mean is this. Each thing has a sound and a shape, and many of them have a color, don't they? Certainly. It doesn't seem to be the craft of naming that's concerned with imitating these qualities. However, but rather the craft of music and painting. Isn't that so? Hermogenes says yes. And what about this? Do you think that just as each thing has a color or some of those other qualities we mentioned, it also has a being or essence? Indeed, don't color and sound each have a being or essence, just like every other thing that we say is? Hermogenes says yes, I think they do. So if someone were able to imitate in letters and syllables this being or essence that each thing has, wouldn't he express what each thing itself is? Hermogenes says he certainly would. And so this is an interesting thing to ponder, because we start with basic imitation. If we did not have voice, we use our bodies to imitate the image that we wish to get across. We would be performing things that are similar to the behaviors and the motions of the worlds around us, perhaps of the animals or of physical objects, the nature of physical objects. But we wouldn't say that this behavior is a name. So if we say that this physical behavior is not a name, we can just, as Socrates said, we can say, well, naming perhaps is a vocal imitation of what it imitates. And in so doing this imitation, he then thereby names the thing that he's imitating. Now I could see within my mind that this imitation would get the point across. But it would not be very sophisticated. The context would be lacking. And the amount of information that you can carry with the exact vocal imitation, let's say of the horse, for example, is limited compared to saying the horse. But that's not quite all. The remainder, I'm not quite sure of. But this is what we are discussing here in this dialogue. Then he brings in music, which is a complicated form of auditory pattern. And so we can say that we imitate. I'm not sure what we can say here, but we can say that what Socrates says, he says, if we imitate things the way we imitate them in music, we won't be naming them, not even if imitation in question is vocal. Now, because in music we are concerned with rhythm, harmony, melody, and we can have rhythm, harmony, melody that represents certain things, like fear, anger, disgust, very profound human emotions. And we can certainly have this coupled with people that are acting these emotions out. And yet, there is still a difference between the musical form and the vocal form that is specific to this specific articulation that is formed to identify an object. And he says each thing has a sound and a shape, and many of them have a color, don't they? Now if we consider this word, again we're getting into the name that is imitation, we can think of it as a copy of something. And in the case of the behavior, it is the physical copy of what the thing in nature does, but it doesn't explain the thing in nature. It's just sort of a mirror to that thing. Similarly in music, and in something like art or painting, it's an imitation of the pattern of sound and of the production of shape. Again, it's a mirror of reality. Even if the shapes or the sounds are not typically heard in our environment until they are played on an instrument or painted on a canvas, the form is still different than the name. It is a copy of what can be, but it doesn't identify the being of that thing. And what about this? Don't you think that just as each thing has a color or some of those other qualities we mentioned, it also has a being or essence? Indeed, don't color and sound each have a being or essence, just like every other thing that we say is? Yes, I think they do, says Hermogenes. So if someone were able to imitate in letters and syllables this being or essence that each thing has, wouldn't he express what each thing itself is? And so I think this is the key point. This is what we were getting at. The naming is specific. It is identifying some core principle of the object of concern. Hermogenes says he certainly would. Socrates, and if you were to identify the person who is able to do this in just a way that you said the first was a musician and the second a painter, what would you say he is? Hermogenes says, I think he's the namer, Socrates, the one we've been looking for from the beginning. And Socrates says, if that's true, doesn't it seem that we are now in a position to investigate each of the names you were asking about? Rho, R-H-O-E, or flowing. I, not sure if that's pronounced correctly, or going, and schisis, restraining, to see whether or not he has grasped the being or essence of each of the things they signify by imitating its being or essence in the letters and syllables of its name. Isn't that so? Hermogenes says, certainly. Come then. Let's see if these are the only primary names, or if there are many others. Hermogenes says, for my part, I think there are others. Socrates says, yes, there probably are. But how are we to divide off the ones with which the imitator begins his imitation? Since an imitation of a thing's being or essence is made out of letters and syllables, wouldn't it be most correct for us to divide off the letters or elements first, just as one who set to work on speech rhythms first divides off the forces or powers of the letters or elements, then those of syllables, and only then investigate rhythms themselves? Socrates says, so mustn't we first divide off the vowels, and then the others in accordance with their differences in kind, that is to say, the consonants and mutes, as I take it they're called by specialists in these matters, and the semivowels, which are neither vowels nor mutes. And as to the vowels themselves, mustn't we also divide off those that differ in kind from one another? Then when we've also divided off the things that are, the things to which we have to give names, if there are some things to which they can all be carried back, as names are to the letters, and from which, among them, in just the way that there are among the letters, once we have done all this well, we'll know how to apply each letter to what it resembles. Whether one letter or a combination of many is to be applied to one thing, it's just the same as it is with painters. When they want to produce a resemblance, they sometimes use only purple, sometimes another color, and sometimes, for example, when they want to paint human flesh or something of that sort, they mix many colors, employing the particular color, I suppose, that their particular subject demands. Similarly, we'll apply letters to things, using one letter for one thing, when that's what seems to be required, or many letters together to form what's called a syllable, or many syllables combined to form names and verbs. From names and verbs, in turn, we shall finally construct something important, beautiful, and whole. And just as the painter painted an animal, so by means of the craft of naming or rhetoric, or whatever it is, we shall construct sentences. Of course, I don't really mean we ourselves. I was carried away by the discussion. It was the ancients who combined things in this way. Our job, if indeed we are to examine all things with scientific knowledge, is to divide where they put together, so as to see whether or not both the primary and derivative names are given in accord with nature. For any other way of connecting names to things, Hermogenes, is inferior and unsystematic. So a scientific approach to language. And so I like, for my own understanding, to reflect on the analogy that Socrates had given with the painter. And he mentions the painter can use only purple in certain instances, or any particular singular color in a particular instance. Now, a single color is not sufficient to produce more sophisticated forms, like flesh. There are multiple colors that go into the representation of the flesh. And of course, it's not just the color. It's the outline. It is the context that gives the flesh its essence, right, or its being, that it is flesh. Now, we can have a color that is similar to flesh, and we can call it the color of flesh. And that in and of itself is a simpler form that's composed of many different colors. But unlike the flesh of an arm, let's say, where the arm is a characteristic of the flesh that is being represented, say that the flesh is torn, and we wish to represent that the flesh is torn, we can have an image, certainly, without the arm. The arm would be a more identifying, I think, to the tearing of the flesh's nature, because it would be easier to see. But if it's detailed enough, I can imagine a void, and within this blackened canvas, we can have the emergence of a pigment that is similar to the representation within the minds of most people, and then within that color, there can be a very familiar disruption of the flesh. And you could have blood, you could have muscle tissue that lies beneath, that all give it sort of the idea and the representation that this is torn flesh. But again, it goes back to the fundamental characteristics of the flesh, that identifying it for what it is. And so in this way, Socrates attempts to take this approach and apply it to words, to letters, to language. Hermogenes says, "By God, Socrates, it probably is." Well then, do you think you could divide them in that way? I don't think I could. Hermogenes says, "Then it's even less likely that I could." Socrates says, "Shall we give up then? Or do you want us to do what we can and try to see a little of what these names are like? Aren't we in a similar situation to the one we were in a while ago with the gods? We prefaced that discussion by saying that we were wholly ignorant of the truth, and were merely describing human beliefs about the gods. So shouldn't we now say this to ourselves before we proceed? If anyone, whether ourselves or someone else, divides names properly, he will divide them in a way we have just described. But, given our present situation, we must follow the proverb and do, quote, do the best we can, end quote, to work at them. Do you agree or not? Hermogenes says, of course, I agree completely. Socrates says, perhaps it will seem absurd, Hermogenes, to think that things become clearer by being imitated in letters and syllables, but it is absolutely unavoidable, for we have nothing better on which to base the truth of primary names. Unless you want us to behave like tragic poets who introduce a deus ex machina whenever they are perplexed. Okay, so this deus ex machina, I looked it up here. It says it is a literary term that refers to a plot device in which an unexpected event or character suddenly appears and provides a resolution to an apparently insoluble problem. It literally means God from the machine in Latin, and it originally referred to a theatrical device in ancient Greek and Roman drama in which a god was lowered onto the stage by a crane to provide a resolution to the play's conflict. So let us continue here. For we, too, could escape our difficulties by saying that the primary names are correct because they were given by the gods. But is that the best account we can give? Or is this one, that we got them from foreigners who are more ancient than we are? Or this, that just as it is impossible to investigate foreign names, so it is impossible to investigate the primary ones, because they are too ancient. Aren't all of these merely the clever excuses of people who have no account to offer of how primary names are correctly given? And yet, regardless of what kind of excuses one offers, if one doesn't know about the correctness of primary names, one cannot know about the correctness of derivative ones, which can only express something by means of those others about which one knows nothing. Clearly, then, anyone who claims to have a scientific understanding of derivative names must first and foremost be able to explain the primary ones with perfect clarity. Otherwise, he can be certain that what he says about the others will be worthless. Or do you disagree? Hermogenes says, no, Socrates, not in the least. Well, my impressions about primary names seem to me to be entirely outrageous and absurd. Nonetheless, I'll share them with you, if you like. But if you have something better to offer, I hope you'll share it with me. Hermogenes says, have no fear, I will. First off, the R seems to me to be a tool for copying every sort of motion, or kinesis. We haven't said why motion has this name, but it's clear that it means hesis, or a going forth, since in ancient times we used E in place of the E with a line over it, or E macron. The first part comes from Kain, or K-I-E-I-N, a non-Attic name equivalent to Ainai, E-I-E-N-A-I, or moving. So if you wanted to find the ancient name corresponding to the present kinesis, the correct answer would be hesis. But nowadays, what with the non-Attic word Kain, the change from E to E macron, and the insertion of N, we say kinesis, though it ought to be kainesis. Stasis, or rest, is a beautified version of a name meaning the opposite of einai, or moving. In any case, as I was saying, the letter R seemed to the name giver to be a beautiful tool for copying motion. At any rate, he often uses it for this purpose. He first uses this letter to imitate motion in the name of rain, R-H-E-I-N, or flowing, and rho, with the macron over the E, indicating flow themselves. Then in tromos, or trembling, and trechain, or trechain, running, and in such verbs as crauein, striking, thrauein, crushing, ericain, rending, thrupatain, breaking, crematazain, crumbling, rumbain, whirling. It is mostly R he uses to imitate these motions. He saw, I suppose, that the tongue was most agitated and least at rest when pronouncing this letter, and that's probably why he used it in these names. He uses I, in turn, to imitate all the small things that can most easily penetrate everything. Hence, in I and I, moving, and haesthai, hastening, he uses I to do the imitating. Similarly, he uses phi, psi, s, and z to do the imitating in such names as sutran, or sukran, chilling, zeon, seething, seisthai, shaking, seismos, quaking, because all of these letters are pronounced with an expulsion of breath. Indeed, whenever the name giver wants to imitate some sort of blowing or hard breathing, or fusodes, he almost always seems to employ them. He also seems to have thought that the comprehension and stopping of the power of the tongue involved in pronouncing D and T made such names as desmos, or shackling, and stasis, rest, appropriately imitative. And because he observed that the tongue glides most of all in pronouncing L, he used it to produce a resemblance in alisthenein, or glide, itself, and in such names as Leon, smooth, Leparon, sleek, Golodes, viscous, and the like. But when he wants to imitate something cloying, he uses names such as glitchtron, gluey, glucu, sweet, and golitis, clammy, in which the gliding of the tongue is stopped by the power of the G. And because he saw that N is sounded inwardly, he used it in endon, within, and entos, inside, in order to make the letters copy the things. He put an A in mega, large, and an E macron in mekos, length. Because these letters are both pronounced long, he wanted O to signify roundness, so he mixed lots of it into the name gongulon, or round. In the same way, the rule setter apparently used other letters or elements as likenesses in order to make a sign or name for each of the things that are, and then compounded all the remaining names out of these, imitating the things they name. That, Hermogenes, is my view of what it means to say that names are correct, unless, of course, Cratylus disagrees. So quite a mouthful there, quite the explanation. In some sense, it's a bit of speculation. We still don't truly know if this is the origin of where this came from, but it is, in some sense, sensical. we began by following a train of thought about the different professions using the fundamental elements of their craft to imitate reality, I suppose. And through this imitation and through the combination of various elements, we see the emergence of more complex things, such as the case in music, in painting, and in language. Now, of course, there are still many questions that remain because of the words mentioned. There are plenty of other letters that are within the words. But it is a solid hypothesis. Unfortunately, there's no true way to know if this was exactly the case, if the rule setter envisioned language to be this way, and exactly what the rule setter is. Because we would have to imagine, or at least I have to imagine, that just as in the day of Socrates, that language had changed from a more meaningful and original purpose to something that is now, in some cases, entirely flipped or stripped of its meaning. In some cases, it's due to euphony or just the beautification of the word to make it sound better. And in other cases, perhaps it's a true loss of meaning or inversion of the meaning of the word. And just as that experience of that loss of translation within the day of Socrates, I think can also apply to the general evolution of language, just the general change of language throughout the years. And while there very well may have been various rule setters and institutions, more likely, that hold more of a unified existence than any one particular master of language, it seems often that within this dialogue they refer to the rule setters being like a singular person. Of course, there are various mentions of these rule setters being various people, but nowhere do we see the recognition of the time that this would have taken in order to come into being. And I'm sure they understood that, but I think it's just an important thing to note before we continue. Again, that language likely took many years to develop, and it wasn't just the case that human beings in a matter of a generation produced a complex and sophisticated language. But it is likely that Socrates is quite correct, that there was this imitative component to it, that before language existed, sounds must have been made, and sounds must have been correlated to actions, behaviors, objects. And this would have been constant among tribes, and as tribes grew, the language grew, surely. And in the case of the ancient Greeks, what was considered to be ancient in the time of Socrates, they must have experienced these various upticks in the progression of their language, and perhaps the more sophisticated version that we see here is what happened during that era, during that golden age. Quite interesting to think about. Well, Socrates, said Hermogenes, as I said at the beginning, Cratylus confuses me a lot of the time. He says that there is such a thing as the correctness of names, but he never explains clearly what it is. Consequently, I'm never able to determine whether his lack of clarity is intentional or unintentional. So tell me now, Cratylus, here in the presence of Socrates, do you agree with what he has been saying about names, or do you have something better to say? If you have, tell it to us. Either you'll learn about your errors from Socrates or become our teacher. Cratylus says, but Hermogenes, do you really think that any subject can be taught or learned so quickly? not to mention one like this, which seems to be among the most important. Hermogenes says, no, by God, I don't. But I think that Hesiod is right in saying that if you can add even a little to a little, it's worthwhile. So if you can add even a little more, don't shrink from the labor, but assist Socrates. He deserves it, and assist me too. Socrates says, yes, Cratylus, please do. As far as I am concerned, nothing I've said is set in stone. I have simply been saying what seems right to me as a result of my investigations with Hermogenes, so don't hesitate to speak, and if your views are better than mine, I'll gladly accept them. And it wouldn't surprise me if they were better, for you've both investigated these matters for yourself and learned about them from others. So if indeed you do happen to have something better to offer, you may sign me up as a student in your course on the correctness of names. And Cratylus says, yes, Socrates, I have, as you say, occupied myself with these matters, and it's possible that you might have something to learn from me, but I fear the opposite is altogether more likely. So much so, indeed, that it occurs to me to say to you what Achilles says to Ajax in the prayers. Ajax, son of Telamon, seeds of Zeus, lord of the people. All you have said to me seems spoken after my own mind. The same is true of me where you're concerned, Socrates. Your oracular utterances, whether inspired by Euthyphro or by some other muse, who has long inhabited your own mind without your knowing about it, seems to be pretty much spoken after my own mind. Socrates. But Cratylus, I have long been surprised at my own wisdom, and doubtful of it too. That's why I think it's necessary to keep reinvestigating whatever I say, since self-deception is the worst thing of all. How could it not be terrible, indeed, when the deceiver never deserts you, even for an instant, but is always right, there with you? Therefore, I think we have to turn back frequently to what we've already said in order to test it by looking at it backwards and forwards simultaneously, as the aforementioned poet puts it. So, let's now see what we have said. We said that the correctness of names consists in displaying the nature of the thing it names. And is that statement satisfactory? Cratylus says, in my view, Socrates, it is entirely satisfactory. Now, for a discussion on exactly what that means, I would refer you to some earlier episodes in which this conversation was fleshed out in more detail than before Socrates got into the mundane identification of specific words and their potential origin and why they mean what they mean. Socrates says, so names are spoken in order to give instruction. Cratylus says, certainly. Is there a craft for that? And are there craftsmen who practice it? Cratylus says, certainly. Who are they? Cratylus says, and you said at the beginning, they're the rule setters. Socrates. Is this craft attributed to human beings in the same way as other crafts or not? What I mean is this. Aren't some painters better or worse than others? Cratylus says, certainly. And the better painters produce finer products, or paintings, while the others produce inferior ones. Similarly, with builders. Some build finer houses, others build inferior ones. Cratylus says, yes. What about rule setters? Do some of them produce fine products, others inferior ones? Cratylus says, no. There, I no longer agree with you. Socrates says, so you don't think that some rules are better and others inferior? Cratylus, certainly not. Nor names either, it seems? Or do you think that some names have been better given, others worse? Cratylus, certainly not. So all names have been correctly given. Cratylus says, yes, as many of them Yes, as many of them as are names at all. What about the case of Hermogenes, which we mentioned earlier? Has he not been given this name at all? Unless he belongs to the family of Hermes. Or has he been given it, only not correctly? Cratylus. I think he hasn't been given it at all, Socrates. People take it to have been given to him. But it is really the name of someone else, namely, the very one who also has the nature. Socrates. What about when someone says that our friend here is Hermogenes? Is he speaking falsely? Or is he not even managing to do that much? Is it even possible to say that he is Hermogenes, if he isn't? Cratylus says, what do you mean? That false speaking is in every way impossible. For isn't that what you are trying to say? Certainly, many people do say it nowadays, Cratylus, and many have said it in the past as well. Cratylus says, but, Socrates, how can anyone say the thing he says and not say something that is? Doesn't speaking falsely consist in not saying things that are? So what can be said of this exchange here? Well, I think there is a potential for confusion. Now, when Socrates says, what about rule setters? Do some of them produce finer products and others inferior ones? And then Cratylus says, no, there I no longer agree with you. So, in the previous example, when we were talking about the painter, and we're talking about the builder, where the painter can produce finer works of art, the builder can produce finer buildings, and poor builders will produce poorer buildings relative, and a poor painter will produce a poorer work of art, or a poorer paint job, we can say. Now, of the rule setter, Socrates asks, do some of them produce finer products and others inferior ones? And I think the interesting thing about this is that when Cratylus disagrees, it's possible that what Cratylus is thinking is that the rule itself is a constant of nature, and therefore the one that set the rule must be correct. But there's a caveat, because just as in the case with Hermogenes, as he is named Hermogenes, but Cratylus says he's not named at all, it would seem to suggest that the name that he was given was the wrong name, and Hermogenes has its own meaning to it. It follows its own rules that are set by some standard. But these rules and the meaning behind that word, although set in stone, it cannot arbitrarily be applied to something or something's nature that does not agree with the nature of the word. Now, in this way, the rule setter that comes up with a rule, that rule then exists for its own sake. But on the other hand, we see Socrates saying, well, just as a painter can be a poor painter, or a builder a poor builder, a rule setter can establish poor rules. And I think this gets into levels of truth. Because we can say, well, what makes a builder, what makes a building? There are certain fundamental criteria by which we can say we can check off the boxes and say that this is a building. Some may not completely agree that this is a building. It doesn't mean that the building does not exist. And then of the builders that can actually produce a building, once the building, that general category, is established, albeit imperfectly, because there will always be individuals that lie at the margins. But as we began to discuss at the beginning of this dialogue, there must be a center around which people congregate, otherwise nothing would be intelligible between individuals. There would be no possibility of society. Nobody would recognize reality in the same way. And so, once we agree on what a building is, then we get into another level. Okay, so we have a building, and we have a builder. But now there is the quality of the builder. Is he a good builder or a bad builder? What is a bad builder? Can a builder still be a builder if he does not produce or satisfy the natural characteristics of what a building is? Does he produce ugly buildings, whereas the competent or good builder produces good buildings? And what is this good building and what is this bad building? Again, it's at this level that we decide that this is a good building or this is a bad building. That doesn't mean that a good building is completely arbitrary. Because a building must exist before a good building to exist. And it is a bit of a strange thing to examine, because at once it would seem as though the human being is able to perceive the truth, but since he is unable to perceive the totality of truth, he must submit to a degree of relativism. Now, this relativism is never completely tapped into or plugged into its source of truth, but it may discover, by way of mathematics, observation, trial and error, he may discover, or by polling various individuals and see what they think about the beauty or the goodness of a building, let's say, then he is able to closely ally himself with the motion of the things that are. And so I think that somewhere in here our conversation must rest. The disagreement between Cratylus and Socrates must rest somewhere in this territory. Socrates says, so you don't think that some rules are better than others? And Cratylus says, certainly not. Nor names either, it seems. Or do you think that some names have been better given and others worse? Cratylus says, certainly not. Because Cratylus believes that what is the name of the thing should match the nature of the object. And so one cannot be improperly named, because if one is to be improperly named, that is, the nature of the name does not match the nature of the object. But see, the thing is, Cratylus doesn't believe in that at all. That relationship doesn't even exist. That it's not possible to name something. It's a sort of a paradox, or it's an opposite. You can't have that which is something else be the thing that is. The thing that is separate from another thing that is. But it's interesting that he declines the incorrectness of a name. Cratylus says, so Socrates says, so all names have been correctly given. Cratylus says, yes, as many of them as names are names at all. And Socrates says, well, what about the case of Hermogenes, which you mentioned earlier? Has he not been given this name at all, unless he belongs to the family of Hermes? Or has he been given it, only not correctly? Cratylus says, I think he hasn't been given it at all, Socrates. People take it to have been given to him, but it is really the name of someone else, namely, the very one who also has the nature. And so I wonder how much of this is semantics. That is to say, Socrates says, well, the name is given incorrectly if the nature of the name doesn't match the nature of the individual. And then Cratylus says, well, no, you can't have a name that is somebody else's name and give it to the individual. And I think it's possible that Cratylus believes that it is not the part of the human being to bestow names upon people, that this is something of a divine origin, that human beings may discover it, and with their own discovery they may attribute the name to the object, but ultimately the name of the object rests within the divine order. And so this incorrectness cannot really exist, because that which is given well, perhaps I should say this is a difficult one to steelman Cratylus' argument here, because it matters what perspective we're talking about, because it's incorrect on the part of the human being if the human being is to name an object that is not after its nature. But the divine source that names all objects is never incorrect. So I'd imagine that this would have to be the argument, that there is no incorrectness of names because of the divine name giver. And so he's denying the human component of this, and he's going straight to the source of our reality. But to deny our view of reality would be to deny the very capability of perceiving the divine reality. And so I think that this must be where he makes a misstep. Now Socrates says, what about when someone says that our friend here is Hermogenes? Is he speaking falsely? Or is he not even managing to do that much? Is it even possible to say that he is Hermogenes if he isn't? Cratylus says, what do you mean? That false speaking is in every way impossible. For isn't that what you are trying to say? Certainly many people do say it nowadays, Cratylus, and many have said it in the past as well. Now this would be a little bit different, a little bit less generous, I think, on the part of Socrates to really determine what Cratylus is saying here. Now Socrates is saying that whatever somebody says is absolutely truth, is the truth. Well, no, that wouldn't be quite correct. Rather, that false speaking is impossible. Now, we could make the leap and just to say that it is only possible to speak the truth. For if it was only possible to speak the truth, or if it was impossible to speak falsely, then it would be dependent on the individual for their own meaning. That meaning is not something that is outside of the individual. It doesn't permeate the outside reality. It only permeates the inside of the individual. A rather strange presumption, I would think. I would rather want Cratylus to be thought of in a more positive light. Cratylus says, "But Socrates, how can anyone say the thing he says and not say something that is? Doesn't speaking falsely consist in not saying things that are?" So what does this mean? How can anyone say the thing he says and not say something that is? Fairly straightforward statement, but difficult to think about. I think it's difficult to think about because of how basic it is. How can anyone say the thing he says and not say something that is? So my mind immediately goes to trying to examine the possibilities of things that I could say that are not. And so if I say that I am female, then I am saying something that is not true. But the things that I am saying, in terms of their words, they are true. They are real things. I am something. Female is something. But together, to say I am female is false. So perhaps this is where Cratylus is getting stuck. Failing to see how things come together to form a different picture. Again, I go back to what I was talking about with the more the divine origin of things and the rejection of the human being, or on the flip side, the divinity of the human being and the rejection of everything else. I'm not quite sure where we are at this point. Doesn't speaking falsely consist in not saying things that are? Now Socrates says, "Your argument is too subtle for me at my age. All the same, tell me this. Do you think it is possible to say something falsely, although not possible to speak it falsely?" Interesting. Do you think it is possible to say something falsely, although not possible to speak it falsely? That would seem like it would be impossible. Unless there is a different meaning for we know that different words or the same word can have two different meanings depending on the context. So saying could mean physically speaking and having real auditory input. Is it possible to say something falsely, although not possible to speak it falsely. And so I would say that if you cannot speak it falsely, then you cannot say something falsely. But on the flip side, it is possible that you can act out something, and in the way that we act out things, it is like we are saying it because we are expressing it. The saying, in that case, doesn't imply physically speaking. But if it is to say that what Socrates is saying here, in both examples, is the physical nature of speaking, then I do not believe that it is possible to say something falsely when it's not possible to speak something falsely. Now Cratylus says, in my view, one can neither speak nor say anything falsely. Now I'm not sure that answers Socrates' question, or perhaps I misinterpret his question. But nonetheless, Socrates responds by saying, what about announcing something falsely or addressing someone falsely? For example, suppose you were in a foreign country, and someone meeting you took your hand and said, "Greetings, Hermogenes, son of Smicreon, visitor from Athens." Would he be speaking, saying, announcing, or addressing these words not to you, but to Hermogenes, or to no one? Cratylus says, in my view, Socrates, he is not articulating them as he should. And Socrates says, well, that's a welcome answer. But are the words he articulates true or false? Or partly true and partly false? If you tell me that, I'll be satisfied. For my part, I'd say that he's just making noise and acting pointlessly, as if he were banging a brass pot. Socrates says, let's see, Cratylus, if we can somehow come to terms with one another. You agree, don't you, that it's one thing to be a name, and another to be the thing it names? Cratylus says, yes, I do. Socrates says, and you also agreed that a name is an imitation of a thing? Cratylus says, absolutely. And that a painting is a different sort of imitation of a thing? Cratylus says, yes. Well, perhaps what you are saying is correct, and I am misunderstanding you. But can both of these imitations, both paintings and names, be assigned and applied to things of which they are imitations or not? Cratylus says they can. Consider this. Can we assign a likeness of a man to a man, and that of a woman to a woman, and so on? Cratylus says certainly. What about the opposite? Can we assign the likeness of a man to a woman, and that of a woman to a man? Cratylus says yes, we can. And are both of these assignments correct, or only the first? Cratylus says only the first. That is to say, the one that assigns to each thing the painting or name that is appropriate to it or like it. Cratylus says that is my view, at least. Now let's back up a little bit and make sure we can follow what is being said here. So after Cratylus makes the statement that one can neither speak nor say anything falsely, and Socrates goes on to say, well, what if you're in a place and someone mistakes you for Hermogenes? Or they greet you and say, welcome, Hermogenes, visitor from Athens. He asks Cratylus if the man is addressing the words not to Cratylus but to Hermogenes, or to no one. Of course, the third option is the mistaken identity. What's interesting is that Cratylus denies the possibility of one to mistake an identity of another. In my view, Socrates, he has not articulated them as he should. And how should he articulate them? Well, he would say that he would greet Cratylus then, and he would make the proper familial statement that he's the son of whatever. He's from Athens. And Socrates, okay, that makes sense. Almost like he's frustrated with Cratylus. But are the words he articulates true or false? Or partly true and partly false? If you tell me that, I'll be satisfied. And so what can we say of the words of the person that greets Cratylus here, but mistakes him for Hermogenes? Well, what he says is false, from my opinion, because he is mistaken the identity of the individual. Now, on the other hand, although he has mistaken the individual for somebody else, he is right to assume that this individual is from Athens. Perhaps he associates Hermogenes with Cratylus. Perhaps he doesn't even know who Cratylus is, but he thinks he is Hermogenes. And so there is a relationship in there that is true. There's an assumption that is true. That assumption may be purely geographical, and compared to the meaning of the greeting, it could seem to pale in comparison to the rest of it. But there is a degree of truth within that. It doesn't mean the entirety of the statement is true, of course. And to say that part of the statement is true is also a bit misleading, because it is not really within the statement. It is a precondition to the formulation of the statement that is both false and true. But this precondition it would seem, has various component parts to it. That is, we discussed the geography and the association of the geography of Athens to the individual in front of him. So that is correct. What is incorrect is the association with the individual in front of him with the individual that actually is. And furthermore, the mistake that the individual that he sees before him is not only another individual, but also an individual by a different father. And so Cratylus says in response to Socrates, "For my part, I'd say he's just making noise and acting pointlessly, as if he were banging a brass pot." Now again, this is really not an answer, just sort of like the first. It seems to be a bit of a dismissal. Now there's a part of what Cratylus is saying here is that if he is just making noise, then the noise is meaningless, and acting pointlessly as if he were banging a brass pot, right? So there's no consistency with the behavior and any directed outcome. But this isn't true, because there is a correlation between the behavior of this individual attempting to greet the person that's in front of him. Just because there is a falsity to what he says doesn't mean that it negates the entirety of the whole. And just because this negation, well, let me reframe. Just because there is a mistaken identity, again, which is something that Cratylus would probably deny. So it's hard to move back all the way to the beginning of his thought, because it's so fundamental to the way that he's seeing this that it's difficult for me to even rewind my own thinking. And so again, Cratylus seems to say that he is just making noise, that this greeting, because it is following a rule, let's say, the rule that must orient things correctly, otherwise, if it is not correct, it is not just false. It doesn't even have direction to it. It's pointless. It's purposeless. Unless it is in line with the truth. And if he had greeted this person, Cratylus, correctly, then it would not be as though he was just making noise or acting pointlessly. He would be articulating his words correctly. But it's interesting that the first response by Cratylus is that he is not articulating them as he should. So there is a recognition there of a falsehood. But what prevents him from admitting this is very strange. It's a very fundamental thing, like I said, in his thinking that prevents him from doing so. The sort of all or none type thinking. And there must be here in Cratylus' thinking a fundamental lack of recognizing a certain reality. He says, for my part, I'd say he's just making noise and acting pointlessly, as if he were banging a brass pot. And it's obvious to me that he is doing more than just making noise, because the noise is directed. It is directed towards a greeting, it is directed to the man that's in front of him, it's directed to a specific man that has some relation to Cratylus. Hermogenes is a friend of Cratylus. And just because it's a case of mistaken identity does not mean that his words are pointless, or that he is just making noise. Because if we take just noise that is without purpose, perhaps we could say that static on a television is just this sort of noise, this noise without a purpose. There is certainly a difference between the two. Now, if he were banging a brass pot, there is some purpose there. I mean, the very things that he is articulating, that he is using in his hands, the brass pot, there's a certain form, a certain purpose to it, made by man. And although he's banging it, there's no particular reason to be banging it. It's sort of out of context. And in that sense, there is certainly a lack of meaning there. But still, and even in that case, in which he is using a bit more of the human flavor, I can say that again, it is not just the wind that is blowing the grass. In this case, in his second example, this is a human being doing a human action, but without a definite direction. And certainly, it is true that this is a human being performing a relatively human behavior, but it is not still at the level of behavior that we see with the case of mistaken identity. And so therefore we cannot easily dismiss the interaction, the hypothetical interaction between this foreign person and Cratylus. Let's see, Cratylus, if we can somehow come to terms with one another. You agree, don't you, that it's one thing to be named and another thing to be the thing it names? So what does it mean to be both of these different categories? Now, to be named, there's one thing to be a name, okay? So the name as this representation of the object, to be the name, that is my name, I have a particular name. And it is another thing to be the thing it names. So I can easily provide a name for an object, but it is not so easy. Well, perhaps this is not the case either, because I'm thinking that if I were to name something truly, I see how slippery the slope is into Cratylus' thinking. Because if I were to name something, it must be after its nature. Now, it's possible that there are multiple ways to name something. There are multiple perspectives to take on one's nature, on the nature of an object. And that's partially due to the different traits and characteristics that make it up. And it's partly due to our own limited view of reality. Now, in the case of to be the thing it names, this is, in some sense, different. It must be different. Because the thing that names is looking into reality. The thing that is being named, or the thing that is, I should say, a name, is as it is in reality. It is not discovering other things that are, because it of itself is. Now, Cratylus agrees with this. And so Socrates says, and you also agree that a name is an imitation of a thing. Now again, this imitation, what is it truly the imitation of? Of reality? And if it is an imitation, then it cannot be perfect. For if it was, as reality is, it would be reality itself. Just as a painter paints perhaps a landscape or a story within his painting. It represents truth. It is an imitation. It is a view into the reality that lies beneath. And so if we agree that there's a difference between the thing that is a name, and that differs from the thing that does the naming, and we also agree that a name is an imitation of a thing, then we understand that there must be some grace here. I must imagine, because of our own limitation. For our naming, and our capacity to do so, is but an imitation. Now, Cratylus agrees with this. Socrates says, and that a painting is a different sort of imitation of a thing. Cratylus agrees. Well, perhaps what you're saying is correct, and I'm misunderstanding you. But can both of these imitations, both paintings and names, be assigned and applied to the things of which they are imitations, or not? Now Cratylus says they can. Now Socrates says this: can we assign a likeness of a man to a man, and that of a woman to a woman, and so on? And so what does it mean, this likeness? Well, it must refer to a quality, or state of being, that's similar or resembling of something, or someone. Of course, it can refer to its physical appearance, its behavior, personality traits, other characteristics that are common between them. Now, with many categories that we have, it's difficult at times to figure out where exactly the line is most firm, beyond which, crossing that line, the nature of the thing that is named is no longer that thing. It no longer goes by that name. At the same time, we also understand, if we think about man and we think about woman, there are many shared characteristics, and yet we have two separate categories for them, each category having its own fundamental characteristics. But I think this is the point. This is sort of the point of the names. Because at one level, we have the separation of the sexes. But above that level, towards the unity, or the shared and common characteristics, we have the human being, which has certain fundamental characteristics. Certain fundamental characteristics beyond which it is no longer the human being, that is something else. And we have all of the various animals that are not human beings that have this categorization of naming and of boundaries and of separation. We have the plants, again with their own structures, organization, and categories. And yet we can go a level higher, and we can say life is a thing that has certain characteristics and traits to it. And we can continue in this way. And we can also see that there are categories and names that are specific to certain things, but that those things also nest within other things. Now, Cratylus agrees with this distinction about assigning the likeness of a man to a man and of a woman to a woman. Socrates says, what about the opposite? Can we assign the likeness of a man to a woman, and that of a woman to a man? Now, my answer to that would be no, because then the category would not exist. There would not be fundamental characteristics for which a name is deserved to categorize that group. Now Cratylus says, yes, we can. And Socrates says, and are both of these assignments correct, or only the first? Cratylus says only the first. Socrates, that is to say, the one that assigns to each thing the painting or name that is appropriate to it or like it. Now Cratylus says that's my view at least. Since you and I are friends, we don't want to mince words. So here's what I think. I call the first kind of assignment correct. Whether it's assignment of a painting, whether it's an assignment of a painting or a name. But if it's an assignment of a name, I call it both correct and true. And I call the other kind of assignment, the one that assigns and applies unlike imitations, incorrect, and, in the case of names, false, as well. Now Cratylus says, but it may be, Socrates, that it's possible to assign paintings incorrectly, but not names, which must always be correctly assigned. Socrates says, what do you mean? What's the difference between them? Can't I step up to a man and say, this is your portrait, while showing him what happens to be his own likeness, or what happens to be the likeness of a woman? And by show, I mean bring before the sense of sight. An interesting thing to say on the part of Cratylus, saying that it's possible to assign paintings incorrectly. But not names, which must always be correctly assigned. And I agree with Socrates what he says. He says, I can easily step up to a person and say, this is your portrait. And this portrait happens to be his own likeness. He could just easily do it to a woman and of her own likeness, so that she can see her own likeness. And now he continues to say that, can't I step up to the same man a second time and say, this is your name? Now, a name is an imitation, just as a painting or portrait is. So, can't I say to him, this is your name? And after that, put before his senses of hearing what happens to be an imitation of himself. Saying man, or happens to be an imitation of a female of the human species, saying woman. Don't you think that all of this is possible, and sometimes occurs? Now this is an interesting concept to bring up here. Because to name something truly is to name something accurately. Now what is forming in my mind here are two different, maybe not two different types of names, but we have the name that Socrates mentions here, to the likeness of man or of the likeness of woman, and he also uses the portrait. Now one addresses the inputs of vision, and one addresses the inputs of sound, or of an auditory nature. Now each type of information is still integrated into our processing software, if you will. And regardless of if it is sound or if it is of sight, the result is the same. You can either have a correct interpretation or an incorrect one. A correct interpretation of reality or an incorrect one. So I can give somebody an arbitrary name. Like, I can walk up to a man and I could say that he is a multivitamin. Now, of course, he's not a multivitamin. He is not in the likeness of a multivitamin. Perhaps he shares certain things in common with the multivitamin, but he is not a multivitamin. I could walk up to him and say that his name is Man. Well, he is a man, and so surely he could be named a man. But his name, whether it be Socrates, Hermogenes, or Cratylus, is not the same as categorizing him as man. His name is personal, it would seem. There is an individualistic component to it. That there's something about the nature of the individual. That there is something common among men, and yet at a level beneath. Therein lies individual distinctions that are fundamental to their own being, just as there's individual distinctions, fundamental traits of their character, to be of the grouping man that is separated from woman. Of course, there are qualities that are shared among them, and they must to be grouped together in even higher categories. But in the most fundamental sense, the individual name serves to represent that individual. And since we are all slightly different in our own way, we have different names. Some of us share the same name, however. Now, when it gets tricky is when since each of us are individuals, it's not easily to determine someone's nature by its name, whereas it might be easier to determine something's nature by another name, man, for example. There are certain things that are fundamental to that we understand. But if I say my name is John, then what about John? What about that name explains anything about me? Dr. Cratylus says, I'm willing to go along with you, Socrates, and say that it occurs. Socrates says, it's good of you to do so, Cratylus, provided you really are willing, since then we don't have to argue any further about the matter. So if some such argument of names takes place, we may call the first of them speaking truly, and the second speaking falsely. But if that is so, it is sometimes possible to assign names incorrectly, to give them not to things they fit, but to things they don't fit. The same is true of verbs. But if verbs and names can be assigned in this way, the same must be true of statements, since statements are, I believe, a combination of names and verbs. What do you think, Cratylus? Cratylus says, the same as you, since I think you are right. Further, says Socrates, primary names may be compared to paintings, and in paintings it's possible to present all the appropriate colors and shapes, or not present them at all, or not present them all. Some may be left out, or too many included, or those included may be too large. Isn't that so? Cratylus says it is. So doesn't someone who presents all of them present a fine painting or likeness, while someone who adds some or leaves some out, though he still produces a painting or likeness, produces a bad one? Cratylus says yes. What about someone who imitates the being or essence of things in syllables and letters? According to this account, if he presents all the appropriate things, won't the likeness, that is to say, the name, be a fine one? But if he happens to add a little or leave a little out, though he'll still have produced an image, it won't be fine. Doesn't it follow that some names are finely made, while others are badly made? Cratylus says, presumably. Now, I'd like to pause here for a moment and return to the reflection I had earlier about the individualism that can be attributed to certain names. I believe that this remains an open question, but there's something about its reasoning that I don't like. Because if we are to have a name such as John, for example, or Socrates or Cratylus or Hermogenes, part of the issue that Cratylus has with the name of Hermogenes is that the meaning of the name Hermogenes does not match the character of Hermogenes, let's say, or of the man that is named Hermogenes. Now, what can we say of the names today? Do any of us know what our names mean in the same way that Cratylus knows what the name Hermogenes means and where it comes from and its relation to Hermes? I would argue that most of us don't. I certainly don't. And what happens in such a case when none of us know the meaning behind the words that we use to describe ourselves? Are these not arbitrary distinctions? I want to read what Socrates said again. What about someone who imitates the being or essence of things in syllables and letters? According to this account, if he presents all the appropriate things, won't the likeness, that is to say the name, be a fine one? But if he happens to add a little or leave a little out, though he'll still have produced an image, it won't be fine. Doesn't it follow that some names are finely made while others are made badly? And so this would still imply that the language, the syllables, has some intrinsic meaning to it. And that if we understand at that level the intrinsic meaning of the name, we can differentiate between the names that are correct and that are incorrect. The statement that Socrates said before. Further, primary names may be compared to paintings. And in paintings it's possible to present all the appropriate colors and shapes, or not to present them all. Some may be left out, or too many included, or those included may be too large. And so what might that look like? Oh, we can imagine a painting of a landscape. A landscape that is full of grass. And yet the color that's added makes the greenness of the grass seem unnatural. Something that we would never really see in our reality. Perhaps it's an off color. It's a green added with something else. Now it is still representative of grass, but there's something a little bit off about it that does not truly represent that grass or the color of that grass. And we also have to remember that the image itself is the imitation. And within this imitation, it could be closer to the truth and farther away from the truth, depending on how it was produced, and how closely it mirrors what it is intending to mirror. In a like manner, we can have a painting in which there are individuals, there are human beings, that are next to a house. The human beings can be twice the size of the house. And we would say that the shape of the human being is false, because relative to the house, he is much larger. And we know that human beings are smaller than our houses, because the human being goes within the house. And so he says, so doesn't someone who presents all of them, that is all of the colors and shapes, present a fine painting or likeness, while someone who adds some or leaves some out, though he still produces a painting or likeness, produces a bad one? Now that would be agreeable, because the degree to which one is to add or subtract something that moves away from the center, which is the object of the imitation, is the degree to which it is either true or false. And so again we return to the statement, or the question, what about someone who imitates the being or essence of things in syllables and letters? According to this account, if he presents all the appropriate things, won't the likeness, that is to say, the name, be a fine one? But if he happens to add a little, or leave a little out, though he'll still have a product, or he'll still have produced an image, it won't be fine. Doesn't it follow that some names are finely made while others are badly made? So yes, we understand this a little bit better, that it is just like the painting. But it would seem, at least in my mind, in the modern mind, that my vision is much more reliable. That is to say that I believe that I can identify what is true and what is false about an image and its likeness to what it is imitating more than I can with syllables and letters. And it's likely due to the fact that I was not properly oriented to the meaning of these letters and these syllables, perhaps the words. Now certainly at some level I am, because I can use combinations of words that produce something that's intelligible to me. But at the fundamentals, perhaps at the level of the shape, comparative to the level of the letter, I'm not sure I understand this. But then the question is, well, at what level of detail are we considering? Of the shape and of the painter, are we considering the exactness of shape, being the study of geometry, and sort of the exactness of linguistics? And I would say there is an element of truth there, that it does involve the precise study of these things. But also in a general sense, without the technical knowledge, we can still appreciate the meaning of things, regardless of if a rectangular house is a perfect rectangle that's represented on the painting, or a perfect O is pronounced perfectly as an O. But the problem is, this O has no meaning to me. Now perhaps the lone rectangle would have no meaning to me either, unless it is placed in the context of some siding, a roof, a couple windows, a door, then I understand it's a house. But this O, I understand it's an O. Perhaps it's too solitary for it to have this type of salience And if I add it with a few other letters, G and D, and I make God out of it, then it becomes meaningful to me. And so Socrates continues and he says, so presumably one person will be a good craftsman of names and another a bad one. And Cratylus says yes. Socrates, and this craftsman is named a rule setter. And Cratylus says yes. By God, presumably some rule setters are good and others are bad then, especially if what we agreed to before is true, and they are just like other craftsmen. Cratylus says, that's right. But you see, Socrates, when we assign A, B, and each other of the letters to names by using the craft of grammar, if we add, subtract, or transpose a letter, we don't simply write the name incorrectly. We don't write it at all, for it immediately becomes a different name, if any of those things happen. Socrates, that's not a good way for us to look at the matter, Cratylus. Why not? What you say may well be true of numbers, which have to be a certain number or not be at all. For example, if you add anything to a number 10 or subtract anything from it, it immediately becomes a different number. And the same is true of any other number you choose. But this isn't the sort of correctness that belongs to things with sensory qualities, such as images in general. Indeed, the opposite is true of them. An image cannot remain an image if it presents all the details of what it represents. See if I'm right. Would there be two things, Cratylus, an image of Cratylus, Cratylus and an image of Cratylus, in the following circumstances? Suppose some god didn't just represent your color and shape the way painters do, but made all the inner parts like yours, with the same warmth and softness, and put motion, soul, and wisdom like yours into them. In a word, suppose he made a duplicate of everything you have, and put it beside you. Would there then be two Cratyluses, or Cratylus and an image of Cratylus? So the point here being that if an image, or I should say, if a thing is duplicated so that in reality the reflection of that object is exactly the same as the object, we can refer to it as an image, but in reality it is the same thing. It is exactly equivalent. Now, in the case of true images that are not created by the gods, or I should say in the case of images that are not created by the gods, so images that are created by man, which may be representative of some reality, we know and we understand that they are not perfect. They can never reach the level of the god. They cannot make a mirror aspect of something else. It can come quite close, but it cannot retain all of the subtle qualities of the initial thing that it represents. It's not as exact as numbers, where Socrates says you can add one thing or subtract another and then have a completely different number. But in the case of images, you can add one thing or subtract one thing, and although the addition or the subtraction can be sufficient enough to change the image, you can also add things and subtract things in such a way that it does not change the image. I mean, you can add things that enhances the image, that brings it closer to reality, or the thing that it is imaging. Cratylus says, it seems to me, Socrates, that there would be two Cratyluses. Socrates, so don't you see that we must look for some other kind of correctness in images and in names we have been discussing, and not insist that if a detail is added to an image or omitted from it, it's no longer an image at all? Or haven't you noticed how far images are from having the same features as the things of which they are images. And Cratylus says, yes, I have. Socrates, at any rate, Cratylus, names would have an absurd effect on the things they name, if they resembled them in every aspect, since all of them would then be duplicated, and no one would be able to say which was the thing and which was the name. And so, from that I get, the name goes only so far in representing or imaging the thing that it is attempting to represent. The thing itself is always sort of purer than the name that is devised. And it is the God or the divine aspect or realm that this perfection lies. Socrates continues by saying, take courage then and admit that one name may be well given while another is not. Don't insist that it have all the letters and exactly resemble the thing it names, but allow that an inappropriate letter may be included. But if an inappropriate letter may be included in a name, an inappropriate name may be included in a phrase. And if an inappropriate name may be included in a phrase which is inappropriate to the things may be employed in a statement. Things are still named and described when this happens, provided the phrases include the pattern of the things they're about. Remember that this is just what Hermogenes and I claimed earlier about the names of the elements. Cratylus, as I remember. Now, at the risk of ending this at a inopportune time, I'm going to end it here, and we will continue and pick up here where we left off with the next episode of Cratylus, the Platonic Dialogue.